My sister-in-law hated me 4 years for marrying her brother. She faked reconciliation but destroyed my wedding dress moments before the ceremony. And when the truth came out, she lost her family and her home. I'm 28 years old, I work in digital marketing, and up until 3 months ago, I was planning what was supposed to be the perfect wedding with the love of my life, Marcus. But turns out his younger sister Isabella decided to turn the most important day of my life into her own personal drama and revenge show. You know? Because apparently I've been stealing her best friend's chance to be my sister-in-law for 4 years. Or something equally ridiculous like that. The thing is, this story doesn't start on the wedding day. But 4 years ago, when I met Marcus at a work conference, and from the first moment I introduced him to his family, Isabella looked at me like I had spit in her face. Marcus and I started dating when he was 24, and so was I, and honestly, everything was amazing from the beginning. Like one of those relationships where you know you found your person. You know what I mean? But when it came time to meet his family, specifically his sister Isabella, who was like 22 at the time, that's when I knew my life was going to get complicated in ways I never imagined. The first time I went to dinner at my in-laws' house, Isabella didn't even greet me. Literally, she walked in, saw me, rolled her eyes, and went straight to her room. My mother-in-law, who's a super sweet lady and has always tried to keep the peace in the family, told me not to worry. That Isabella was like that with everyone, but I knew it was different. I could feel it. Turns out Marcus had been in a relationship with Sophie, Isabella's best friend, during college, and it was one of those toxic on and off relationships that last like 3 years but don't actually work because the people are completely incompatible. Marcus told me everything from the beginning, that he and Sophie loved each other but they fought all the time, that she was super jealous and controlling, and that in the end, they both realized it was better to be friends, or more like acquaintances because they didn't exactly stay best friends after all that either. This had happened like 2 years before I appeared in Marcus's life. I mean, it's not like I showed up and destroyed a happy relationship or anything like that, but for Isabella, that didn't matter at all. Isabella had basically decided in her head that Sophie was the perfect person for her brother, and that eventually they were going to get back together and get married and have beautiful babies. And when I showed up and ruined that imaginary plan, I became her worst enemy. During the first months of my relationship with Marcus, Isabella literally acted like I didn't exist. Like I'd say hi and she'd completely ignore me. Or I'd try to make conversation, and she'd respond with monosyllables while looking at her phone. My mother-in-law would always apologize for her and say she was young and immature, that she'd mature eventually, but my father-in-law, who's a more direct man, would tell Isabella to drop the drama and behave like an adult, which obviously never happened. What made all this more frustrating is that Sophie kept being super close to Isabella. I mean, they'd been best friends since high school and they still hung out all the time. And I knew, because Marcus had told me that Sophie still had feelings for him even though they'd broken up years ago. Isabella basically fed those false hopes. Like she'd tell Sophie that Marcus and I weren't going to last, that it was just a phase, that he'd eventually realize Sophie was his soulmate, or some nonsense like that. And the worst part is that Sophie believed her, or wanted to believe her. I don't know. But the situation was super uncomfortable every time we coincided at some family event where Isabella obviously invited Sophie. Fast forward like 2.5 years later, Marcus proposed to me on a beach trip we took. It was super romantic and perfect. And obviously I said yes, because I love him with all my heart, and knew I wanted to spend the rest of my life with him. When we announced our engagement, my family was super happy. My friends cried with excitement. My in-laws hugged us and congratulated us with tears in their eyes. My mother-in-law was already planning the wedding in her head. But guess who was the only person in Marcus's entire family who didn't congratulate us? Didn't even say a word. Yeah, Isabella. She was sitting in the dining room when we gave the news, literally saw us, stood up, and went to her room without saying absolutely anything. My father-in-law was furious. He yelled for her to come back, but she yelled back at him to leave her alone. And right there, I knew the wedding was going to be a problem. We spent the next months planning everything. Looking for the perfect venue, choosing the menu, tasting cakes, all those things that are supposed to be fun but are also super stressful. My in-laws insisted we invite Isabella despite everything, because at the end of the day, she was Marcus's sister and they didn't want there to be a permanent division in the family. Marcus agreed, even though he was also fed up with his sister's attitude. But I decided to be the bigger person and accepted inviting her, thinking that maybe, just maybe, She was going to mature and accept that her brother had chosen to build his life with me. To my surprise, Isabella accepted the invitation, and not only that, but one day she showed up at my house. She had never come to my house, never, in 4 years, and told me she wanted to talk to me. I was like, okay, this is going to be weird, but I let her in and we sat in the living room. She told me she'd been reflecting a lot and that she realized she'd been unfair to me, and that I wasn't to blame for anything, and that she was just being a good friend to Sophie, but that it was time to accept that Marcus and Sophie were never getting back together. She apologized to me for all the years of treating me badly and told me she wanted to start over, that she wanted us to be real, family. I, being the naive person I am, believed her, or wanted to believe her, because honestly I was tired of the tension and just wanted everyone to be okay. I told her I accepted her apology and that I was glad we could finally have a civil relationship. The next few months before the wedding, Isabella was almost nice to me, like she'd ask me how the plans were going, tell me she was excited about the wedding. She even helped me choose some decorations when we went shopping with my mother-in-law. I was thinking, wow, she's finally maturing. This is finally going to work. Marcus was also surprised but happy that his sister was finally accepting our relationship. My in-laws were relieved. My mother-in-law told me she knew Isabella just needed time. And I believed it all, like an idiot. The wedding day arrived, June 15th, a day that was supposed to be perfect, that we'd been planning for over a year. The ceremony was scheduled for 4 in the afternoon at a beautiful hotel we had, reserved, with a view of the garden and everything super elegant. I was in the hotel suite getting ready with my bridesmaids. My mom was there too, helping me with everything, and I was nervous but happy, you know, those good nerves of knowing your life is going to change for the better. My dress was beautiful. I'd had it custom made. It had cost me like $2,000. It was white lace with a fitted bodice and a skirt that flowed perfectly, and I felt like a princess when I put it on. Isabella had arrived early at the hotel, which surprised me because I thought she was going to arrive late just to annoy everyone. But there she was, helping with the decorations, being nice to everyone. 1 hour before the ceremony, she knocked on my suite door and asked if she could come in to see me in the dress. My friend said yes, come in. And she entered with a large iced coffee in her hand, one of those from Starbucks with extra ice and cream. She told me I looked beautiful, that Marcus was very lucky, and I thanked her, thinking, wow, she really had changed. And then it happened. Isabella was standing there, smiling, holding her coffee, and suddenly, like in slow motion, I saw how she deliberately, intentionally, turned the entire cup over onto the bodice of my dress. The iced coffee with cream spilled all over the white lace, staining it brown, soaking the fabric, completely ruining the top part of my dress. I froze, literally couldn't process what had just happened, and my friends screamed, and my mom ran toward me, and Isabella stood there with the empty cup in her hand and a smile on her face. My mother-in-law had entered right behind Isabella, had seen everything, and exploded in a way I'd never seen in her. She yelled at Isabella how dare she, that she was a spoiled and selfish child, to get out of the room immediately and not dare to show up at the ceremony, that she was completely banned from attending the wedding. Isabella tried to say it had been an accident, that she'd tripped, but my mother-in-law yelled that she'd seen her perfectly, that she knew she'd done it on purpose, and to leave before she called security. Isabella left crying, screaming that everyone hated her, that nobody understood her, basically making a scene worthy of a reality show. I was in shock, looking at my ruined dress, wanting to cry but also so furious I couldn't even speak. My friends immediately went into crisis mode. One called the hotel asking for cleaning products, another searched the internet for how to remove coffee stains from lace. My mom hugged me while I tried not to completely collapse. The ceremony was scheduled to start in less than an hour, and my dress was ruined, literally ruined. And all because a 6-year-old girl couldn't get over the fact that her brother didn't want to marry her best friend. What happened next was like an organized miracle. My bridesmaids and the hotel staff worked like crazy to clean the dress, using every trick possible, drying it with hair dryers, treating the stains with specialized products the hotel had because apparently this wasn't the first dress emergency they'd seen. Like 45 minutes passed of pure stress. I was shaking. Marcus had come to the door asking what was happening, but my friends didn't let him in because he couldn't see me before the ceremony. And finally, they managed to clean most of the stain. There were some very light marks left that you'd only notice if you got really close. But with the veil and the ceremony lights, nobody was going to notice it. The ceremony started 45 minutes late. All the guests were confused but waiting patiently. And when I finally walked in, Marcus saw me and his eyes filled with tears. And in that moment, I forgot everything else. We got married, said our vows. It was beautiful despite the previous disaster. And when they declared us husband and wife and we kissed, I felt like everything had been worth it. Isabella obviously wasn't there. My mother-in-law had made sure she couldn't enter even the garden where the ceremony was, and honestly, the wedding was better without her. After the ceremony, at the reception, my in-laws found Marcus and me and told us they were cutting all contact with Isabella until she apologized to us for real. Not a fake apology like the one she'd given me before, but a real apology recognizing what she'd done. They told her she had to leave their house, that they weren't going to tolerate her immature and manipulative behavior anymore, and that until she demonstrated she could be a decent person, they didn't want to know anything about her. My father-in-law was particularly furious because he said he'd endured years of Isabella's drama, but this was the limit. That intentionally ruining her brother's wedding was unforgivable. The week after the wedding, before we left for our honeymoon, I started receiving messages from fake profiles on Instagram and Facebook. They were clearly from Isabella, like the profile pictures were random images from the internet, but the messages were definitely from her. She told me she'd done it on purpose, that she wanted to ruin my perfect day, that I didn't deserve Marcus, that Sophie should have been the one to marry him. She also said her parents were traitors for kicking her out of the house, that she was the victim in all of this, that everyone had abandoned her. I saved all the screenshots, because I knew I was going to need them. One day I decided I'd had enough and called her directly. When she answered, I didn't let her talk. I just let out everything I'd been holding in for years. I told her she was a spoiled and pampered child who'd never matured a single day in her life, that Sophie was a loser who was still obsessed with my husband after years since they broke up, and that they were both pathetic for still clinging to a fantasy that was never going to happen. I told her she'd ruined her relationship with her own family by being selfish and vindictive, that nobody had abandoned her but that she'd chosen to destroy her own relationships, and that until she grew up and accepted responsibility for her actions, she was going to keep being miserable. I hung up before she could respond, and blocked her real number too. Apparently, after that call, Isabella disappeared. My in-laws received a call from Marcus's aunt, my mother-in-law's sister, saying that Isabella had shown up at her house crying, saying her parents had kicked her out for no reason, that I hated her and had convinced Marcus to cut contact with her, basically telling a completely false story where she was the innocent victim. The aunt, who lives in another city and hadn't been at the wedding, believed her and let her stay at her house. My in-laws tried to explain the truth, but the aunt said she wanted to hear both sides before judging. What we didn't know is that Isabella had a history of doing exactly this. My in-laws told us that since high school, every time Isabella had problems or fought with someone, she'd disappear for days or weeks, usually going to stay with some distant relative or friend, telling exaggerated or false stories about how her parents were terrible to her. She'd always been super dramatic and constantly sought attention, and this was just another iteration of that pattern. They said when she was a teenager she did it like once a year, and that each time her parents had to go find her and bring her back, but that they thought she'd outgrown that phase. Finally, the aunt decided to investigate more and called my mother-in-law directly to hear her complete version of events. My mother-in-law told her everything, from Isabella's 4-year resentment to the coffee incident on my wedding dress, and sent her photos of the stained dress that my friends had taken that day. The aunt realized Isabella had lied to her completely and kicked her out of her house too, telling her she wasn't going to tolerate manipulation and lies. Isabella ended up going to live with Sophie, which makes sense because in the end, they're both obsessed with the same impossible fantasy. Sophie tried to get involved in the situation too. She sent me messages saying I was cruel to Isabella, that I should be more understanding, that Isabella was just going through a hard time. I responded that Isabella was a 6-year-old adult who'd made adult decisions and now had to deal with the adult consequences of those decisions, and that if Sophie wanted to keep being her friend and enabler, that was her problem. But to stop trying to manipulate me too. Marcus suggested half-jokingly that if Isabella kept being missing, we should report her as a missing person to the police, obviously knowing she wasn't really missing but like to call her bluff. We didn't have to do it because like 2 days later Isabella showed up. Isabella showed up at my in-laws' house, rang the doorbell, and when my father-in-law opened the door, she demanded that they apologize to her. Yes, you read that right. She wanted them to apologize to her for kicking her out of the house, for believing the lies I'd supposedly told about her, for choosing me over their own daughter. My father-in-law, who's generally a very calm man, told her to leave immediately, that there wasn't going to be any apology from him, and that if she didn't leave voluntarily, he was going to call the police. Isabella started screaming, saying they were the worst parents in the world, that she wished she'd never been born into this family, all kinds of hurtful things, and my father-in-law kept his word and called the police. When the police arrived, Isabella was still on the porch screaming, and the officers asked her to calm down and leave because the homeowners were asking her to leave the property. She tried to explain to them that it was her house, that she'd grown up there, but my father-in-law showed them that Isabella no longer lived there, officially, and that he had the right to ask her to leave. The officers escorted Isabella off the property. She left crying and screaming, and my in-laws had to sit down for a while afterward because all of that had been super stressful. My mother-in-law called me crying that night, saying she never thought she'd have to call the police to remove her own daughter from her house, but that Isabella hadn't left her any other choice. Marcus and I went on our honeymoon like 2 weeks after all that drama. We needed to get away from everything and just focus on us and our marriage. We went to Italy. It was incredible. 2 weeks without thinking about Isabella or Sophie or all the circus they'd created. When we got back, there was an email from Isabella waiting for me. It was long, like 3 pages long, and it was supposedly an apology. It said she'd realized she'd been wrong, that the coffee had been an accident, but that she should have been more careful, that she was just trying to be a good friend to Sophie, but that she'd crossed the line. But even in her apology, she kept justifying her actions, kept saying she'd been a good friend, that her intentions were pure even though her actions were wrong. Marcus and I read the email together and decided it wasn't enough. We weren't going to respond. We weren't going to give her the satisfaction of knowing we'd read her half-assed apology. My in-laws didn't respond to similar emails they received either. The family policy now is basically that Isabella can come back when she's ready to give a real apology, without justifications, without playing the victim, just recognizing what she did and why it was wrong. And until then, we've all moved on with our lives without her. 3 months after the wedding, Isabella is still living with Sophie as far as we know. My in-laws occasionally get news about her through distant relatives but have no direct contact. Sophie is apparently supporting her financially because Isabella lost her job when all this exploded. I don't know if she got fired or quit or what, but basically, the two of them are living in their own fantasy world where they're the victims of this whole situation. Marcus has made it clear he's not going to re-establish contact with his sister until she demonstrates real change, not just words but actions, and I completely support him in that. Last week, my mother-in-law called me just to see how I was doing, to tell me she was so sorry for everything Isabella had done, that she and my father-in-law never imagined things would go this far. I told her it wasn't her fault, that they'd done everything possible to raise Isabella right, but that in the end each person is responsible for their own decisions, and that Isabella had chosen this path for herself. My mother-in-law told me she considered me more her daughter than Isabella at this point, that she was grateful Marcus had me in his life, and that made me cry a little, because despite all the drama, I have incredible in-laws who support me. Marcus and I are good. Better than good, actually. Living in our apartment, building our life together, planning the future. Sometimes I think about Isabella and wonder if someday she's going to mature, if she's going to realize everything she lost because of her obsession with controlling her brother's life, if Sophie will ever move on and find her own happiness instead of clinging to an ex-boyfriend from years ago. But honestly, those aren't my concerns. They're not my responsibility. And I've learned you can't force people to grow or change. You can only control how you respond to their actions. My wedding dress, by the way, is stored in a special box in our closet, professionally cleaned and preserved after the wedding. The coffee stains came out almost completely. There are only some very light marks left that nobody would notice unless they knew what to look for. And honestly, those marks are like a reminder that we survived that day. That even though someone tried to ruin our moment, we still got married and were happy. When I have a bad day, sometimes I open the box and look at the dress, and I remember that if we could get through that, we can get through anything together.